So we left off last week at, I don't remember, Tel Dan. We were talking about Tel Dan and what we saw there. There we go. That's the picture I couldn't start off with. The rock there has a carving on it, and it's not in any foreign language. It's in English, and it says, "Do not touch the rocks." I am not. I know it looks like it. I am not touching that rock. I'm very close to it, but there's a little divot there, so I'm just close. I'm not touching the rock. As you'll notice, I kind of not thinking. I didn't take pictures of the awnings over the archaeological digs, but apparently, from talking to someone else who made this trip before I did about 20 years ago, all of this, they're protecting the archaeological digs. They're putting coverings over them, and they're trying to be a little more careful with them. That's apparently a new development as they are trying to make sure these things are being preserved and protected. So, and then someone like me comes along and plays with their signs. But I did not touch that rock. But they are interested in now preserving a little more what they weren't interested in previously. Yes?
You brought it up several times about how the organized, people have been interested in things in the past for forever. Mm-hmm. But organized archaeology is not that old.
Right.
They're trying to protect this digs. Well, Lord Carnarvon used explosives to blast into
Right.
tombs.
Right. I mean, when they first started archaeology, they were just not even caring about the process. And it's been more recent that they're like, maybe we shouldn't use dynamite to enter this cave. Maybe we should dig and be a little more careful. And that you kind of see the development of that. Even it's kind of interesting. You study the places, you study where they're from, you study where they are in the Bible and other resources, and then you also study how they found it and how they recover some of these things. And I'm trying to not tell you every story because we would just get caught up in so many. But after we left Tel Dan, and we'll get to where the other picture where I didn't touch the rock was in a minute. We went up further north to a city that you're going to immediately recognize the New Testament name, and that's Caesarea Philippi. Now, for those of you who have unfortunately been following along this whole journey, the first archaeological site we really got to see and explore was Caesarea Maritima, or Caesarea by the Sea. And that's where Herod built a city to invite the Romans into Palestine and say, this land is your land. And the Romans were very glad to have that. Well, Caesarea Philippi is another one of Herod's builds, and it's the same idea, except it's inland and way up north. In fact, it's north of Dan, and Dan used to be the city they used as the marker of you're not in Palestine anymore when you go past Dan. That's how far north Caesarea Philippi is. It's north of where the Jordan River starts. It does have one of the three sources. It is on the foothills or on the base of Mount Hermon, which is a dominating mountain in that region that I showed you last week was still covered in snow. And it was very interesting to see how close we got to Mount Hermon, even though we couldn't go to Mount Hermon because, crossing the border is kind of frowned upon when you don't have the right papers and visas and stuff. Yes?
Where is Caesarea?
The city of Caesar. So he's naming this for Caesar, and his son Philip is what Herod the Great is naming this city for, that he built, again, to invite the Romans into the region. Now, what's interesting about Caesarea, well, first of all, to describe what's going on in the picture here, is you're in the main town that Herod built, and you're looking at what would essentially be a ancient Roman temple site that Herod would have had built. The cave over here to your right hand was considered to be a dwelling place of Pan, the Roman god of debauchery and other things. So they thought that he lived in the cave. I mean, they knew he didn't, but the story was he lived in the cave, and so they built this temple to Pan there, and they would go up there and try to get their blessings of Pan. And because they're worshiping Pan, and Pan is kind of one of their gods of hedonism and other things, the celebrations could get quite raucous there. And so this was a temple site where all of that happened. That was kind of the main reason why Caesarea Philippi was a location in the first century that anybody would go to. This was the major draw. All right. Now, did I see a hand over here?
Yeah, Ham was like part goat.
Yes, he was. He was a part goat god.
Wants to live in a cave.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So he's the part goat god, and that kind of a wild character if you study the mythology of the Greeks and the Romans. So, the most famous thing in the Bible that happened at Caesarea Philippi is found in Matthew 16. And in Matthew 16, if you start reading in about verse 13, it says, "When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying," what's he about to ask them? Anybody know? Who do they say that I am? Now, he could be doing this in the shadow of a temple to Pan. We always focus on the other things going on. He's fulfilling the prophecies, especially Matthew is focused on that. And he's, some people are trying to figure out, are you John the Baptist? Because he's been murdered. Are you the resurrected him? Who are you exactly is the question. But when you consider that he's also in the shadow of a Roman temple to a false god, and he's saying, who are they saying I am? It's actually interesting that nobody's mistaking him for a Greek or a Roman god, even though they were right there in the location where he was being a Greek or Roman god was being worshipped. But they give their answers, and then, of course, he says, "But who do you say that I am?" And that's where Simon Peter speaks up and says, "You are the Son of the living God." As far as we know, this is the most northern location that we have recorded that Jesus went to when he was on this earth. This was as far north as he got, and the only thing that he may have done further up there is found in Matthew chapter 17, but we don't know exactly where the events of Matthew chapter 17 happened because we're not told. So to assume he goes any further than this point is an assumption. Now I'm going to tell you in a minute why I think it's a safe assumption, but this isn't the only Jesus that this is the furthest point north we read of him going. What other Jesus comes this far north? Joshua does. In Joshua chapter 12, verse 7, it says, "And these are the kings of the country which Joshua and the children of Israel conquered on this side of the Jordan, on the west from Baal-Gad." Well, Baal-Gad over time is going to be destroyed by Joshua and rebuilt. And when they rebuild it, they're going to name it Banyas. And that's after Pan, because the P and the B are kind of interchangeable. So Panyas, Banyas, same city. And then Herod's going to come and do a rebuild and make it Caesarea Philippi. So two Jesuses, Joshua being also the Hebrew name that would be translated to the Greek Jesus, came to this location to conquer. But one came to conquer with military, and the other came to conquer with salvation. I had the blessing of doing the Devo at this location. And luckily I was told enough time in advance that I could do some of this research that I found out. And that's what I focused on is how Jesus came to conquer. And he came to conquer our hearts. He came to conquer with salvation and save us, not conquer us and defeat us. And the difference between him and Joshua is what I kind of focused on there. And one of the ladies pulled me aside afterwards and goes, "Next time, just sing Victory in Jesus." And I'm like, yeah, I should have done that. That would have been very smart. But we'll get to the rest of that in just a second.
Well, given the proximity to Mount Hermon, and given the proximity, even though it doesn't have to be chronological, between chapter 16 and 17.
Right,
and
right. Someone's jumping ahead. Someone looked at the Bible and got ahead of me. But we won't deduct his grade. We'll encourage that because looking at the Bible is a good thing to do. In Matthew chapter 17 is the transfiguration of Jesus. That's where it's recorded. Now there are two sites that are considered the place where Jesus might have been transfigured. One is Mount Tabor, which is in the very central part of Galilee. And actually, there'll be a picture of that in a minute because we came south the next day and we went by Mount Tabor, but there was really not much else to see there. It's just kind of an abandoned hill. And that's why I don't think the transfiguration happened at Mount Tabor, Because when you look at Matthew 17, verse 1, now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And I think Luke might even say an exceedingly high mountain, or one of the translations does. Mount Tabor is not an exceedingly high mountain. Mount Tabor is a hill. All right, and it's about the same height as Mount Gilboa or any of the other mountains in that central Israel range. So I don't think Mount Tabor fits the bill of being an exceedingly high mountain. However, Mount Hermon, the highest mountain in the region, would be an exceedingly high mountain. And if we trust the chronology of Matthew, he was already in Caesarea Philippi. Why not go a little further north to Mount Hermon and have this moment of the transfiguration up there? And by the way, interesting thing about that, if Moses came to the Mount, Moses came to the Mount Transfiguration, we do know that. But if he came to the Mount Transfiguration and it was at Mount Tabor, what's the problem with that? He's now entered the promised land. And what's Moses' relationship to the promised land? None shall pass. He's not allowed to enter. Mount Hermon is not in the promised land. It would be north of it. So, I'm just saying, I think Mount Hermon is the mountain where Jesus was transfigured. I think he went from Caesarea Philippi and continued north to Mount Hermon, had this moment proving who he is, and there again, that brings us right back to our theme of victory. Because his transfiguration is an announcement of who he is, which means he is the right person to give victory to us over our sins and for our salvation. Andrew.
There's also the fact that it says after 6 days, he took them to a hill. And since traveling back then was worse than rush hour, I feel like it would have been quicker, maybe taken.
It wouldn't have taken them 6 days to get up to Mount Hermon, actually. They could have been back to Tabor by then. But if they stayed a few days in Caesarea, they would have been on the base to go up to Mount Hermon.
Well, it's difficult to push too far in speculation, but
Right.
given the circumstances and given, then is it possible that the events of Matthew 4 occurred there as well?
No. Well, okay. We don't know where the events of Matthew 4 happened, but most of that is considered to happen further south, down beyond the Shephelah into the wilderness. And when you see that area, this area doesn't look like wilderness. It's green, it's lush, it's a mountain forest. When you go down there, you see wilderness.
Well, I get that. My only point is that the vistas from the top of Mount Hermon in the context of the time would have included multiple principalities and kingdoms.
Right.
And symbolically
Could have seen some of the things that Satan shows to him. So yeah, it's a possibility, but most traditions have that much further south into the wilderness that when you go past Beersheba, gets you into that. So, but I'll be honest. So I have one picture from Caesarea Philippi. I did take a few others. It's a cave. It's a cave with some ruins in front of it. And it was neat to see, but there wasn't much that was as picturesque as some of the other sites that we'll be seeing. For instance, we came down from Caesarea Philippi back into Israel, back further south, ate lunch. By the way, this is all on Shabbat, or the Sabbath. There was a lot of restaurants that were closed. Can I tell you about the elevator? So at the hotel, there's 3 elevators. I'm really glad we were only staying at a 3-story hotel at that time, because one of the elevators stopped on every floor and opened and just stayed open. And then it would close and go up. And so that was so that the people could keep the Sabbath, the Jews could keep the Sabbath that day. And so that made it interesting. We ate at a little mini ball for lunch that day, and it was all Arabic people. It was all so because the good Jews were practicing Shabbat, and they wouldn't have been seen anywhere near there. And that's where we found out that our guide Murad really likes McDonald's. I thought he was being funny, but he really likes McDonald's. I did not eat at McDonald's. There was another restaurant. Anyways, so we come down there, we stop for lunch, and eventually we get to Hazor. There's a few sites that we saw that, yes, they're mentioned in the Bible, but there's not that much in the Bible about them. However, they're still important for us to study because it gives us an idea of what life looked like at various times in the Bible. One of the places we already looked at, Bet Shean, was one of those places to really get that out of it. And you can see the different generations and how the different societies through the years built different towns on the same hill. That's all really cool there. And so Hazor is kind of the same thing. And it's known as Tel Hazor there, Hill of Hazor would be how we translate that. And these are just a few sites from Hazor. For instance, here on, that would be your left, is you're looking at a gate, but this is an interesting gate because it was a gate that connected the lower city to the upper city. All right, so Hazor was big enough at one time to actually have two levels of the city. You had the lower city where people lived, and then you had the upper city. And I'm opening the thing here, and if anybody wants to look at these afterwards, as long as you don't tear them up, I'll let you look at them. But I'm trying to remember if this is a Canaanite gate or an Israelite gate. Let's see here. It was... Yeah, that's a Canaanite gate you're looking at. So that gate dates back before at least David, maybe even before that. All right, and we'll get to the significance of that here in just a minute when we get to where Hazor appears in the Bible. Yes? Hazor. 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 So, and I was nice and didn't go That. But anyways, on this other side here, and that's our guide, Murad. And again, he's a pretty tall fellow, so you can kind of get the inclination of how tall these gates are. These are gates that were definitely built by Solomon. There's an inscription on them and everything. So Solomon built those gates at Hazor. They are upper on top of the hill. And again, this will all become clear why they're building gates and having levels on the city here in just a minute when we get to its significance in the Bible. So Canaanite on this side, Solomon on this side. Here in the center, and by the way, that's the wall I'm not touching in the other picture. I'm not touching it. Here, this is a Canaanite palace. And you would enter into the palace, and you can get the feeling of this being a throne room. They built a platform on top of the original floor, so you're not walking on it anymore, but you can see around. There's a lot of columns. There's a lot of other things all at Tel Hazor to kind of just see how the Canaanites lived there. And that's what's interesting, is the ruins of the Canaanites and the Israelites are actually mixed in together, because instead of just building a whole new level like at some of the other sites, Bet Shean and some of the other ones, they just moved in and removed the Canaanite stuff and moved the Israelite stuff in. So let's go ahead. I have some more pictures of there, but let's go ahead and get to the biblical significance of this. And again, it goes back to Joshua, who conquered Hazor. Anybody remember what's really key about the city of Hazor and Joshua's conquering?
Isn't that when the sun sits still for like 3 days?
No, but you're on the right track. So when Joshua really only, I think, reports about 4 or 5 major battles. Jericho, followed by Ai and Bethel. And then the southern Canaanite cities are so very accommodating that they decide to gather together and attack Gibeah, which had made the peace treaty with Israel. And they attack Gibeah, and Gibeah calls up Joshua and says, hey, Joshua, come here. You got to defend us because of that treaty you signed without God's approval or permission. And so Joshua has to show up. He shows up overnight, and he conquers the city. But the cleanup takes so long that he has to request the sun to stand still. That's what Andrew was referring to. In the meanwhile, so if you were looking at the map, when you come into Jericho, you've split the promised land in half when you control Jericho. At that day and time, it was such a significant city. And so they went south and conquered the southern armies who had all come together. Meanwhile, in the north, the northern cities are doing the same thing that the southern cities were, and they were coming together so that they could attack Israel all at once, because they thought that was their best chance in defeating Israel, was uniting. Guess who was the leader? Guess. Huh? Hazor. Hazor was the lead of that northern coalition. And so that's why I said you're close, because if you go to the very next chapter, that's where Hazor is leading the coalition to fight against the Israelites. Joshua wins, and then he goes up to Hazor, sieges the city, and tears everything down. Which is why it's shocking the next time we run into Hazor what they're doing. I don't know. Do y'all know? Do y'all know where Hazor is mentioned next? It's in the book of Judges.
Samson carried away the keys to the city?
Nope, that was down in the Philistine area. This predates that by a few generations. It's in Judges chapter 4 and 5. Deborah.
Is that where Sisera was camped?
Sisera wasn't camped there. He was the general, the Canaanite general for the city. Wait a second. Didn't they already defeat that city? Didn't they already run the Canaanites out? Didn't Joshua conquer it? Yes. But they moved back in because the Israelites refused to hold the city. By the way, this is in the Ephraimite land. And if you study that history, the Ephraimites were the ones that said, you didn't give us enough land. We don't like the land you give us. We can't defeat the Canaanites. Well, call it self-fulfilled prophecy maybe. They didn't defeat the Canaanites. The Canaanites have moved back into Hazor, and they're under the leadership of King Jabin, whose general is Sisera. And from Hazor, they are able to oppress the land for a generation. And that's when Barak is called to defeat them and then gets prodded along by Deborah to do so. This is the location. So that's why probably the Canaanite ruins you're looking at are probably from Jabin's time. It is not until Solomon that the Israelites move into the city and take it and build it up and make it an Israelite outpost. All right? And so if you read 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15, it says, and this is the reason for the labor force which King Solomon raised to build the house of the Lord, his own house, the Milo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. All the locations mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15 are strategic locations for the army. Notice it mentioned Megiddo. We already went over. That's a battle place. That's a hill that you put an army on top of so you can watch the Jezreel Valley and protect it. Well, guess what? These are the right. No, these aren't the right pictures. Let's go ahead and skip ahead to these pictures. All right. Hazor is a town on a hill that sits in the middle of a valley. The valley is surrounding it. And what you're looking at on this picture on the right side is the back of an Israelite tower that dates back to Solomon's time. And you're looking at the northern end of the valley. See the hills on either side? And so you're looking out, and when you stand on that tower by our friend here, our watchman right there, when you're standing by our watchman right there, you can see anything coming into that valley from any direction. By the way, guess what also ran through that valley? 2 major roads. So if anybody comes in on one of the major roads into central Israel, they have to come to Hazor. Now, this is the tower from the other direction. Okay? I'm not a photographer. But this is one of my pictures. Should I say I'm proud of? Because that's bad. Don't be proud of it. I was just glad I got this picture. Because I got away from the rest of the group. Because by this point, I'm not touching the wall. I'm taking pictures of the do not enter signs. So they're watching me now. and I've wandered a little too much. And so they're kind of keeping an eye on me because they don't trust me by myself. And so luckily I got away from the group. And I'm actually standing on a hill with it's not like a steep cliff. I'm not that exciting, but it's pretty steep that I could fall. And I kind of got back there and I leaned down and took the picture up of it above it with the clouds behind it. I thought it was really cool. And I'm trying to give you the idea of the height to it, because this tower where it's built, you're looking up to it and it's on the northern corner of the city, looking into that valley. You can see everything. And here's why I bring that up. Because in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and took Ijon, Abel-Beth-Maacah, Janoah, Kadesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried them captive to Assyria. Solomon builds up Hazor as a defensive position to protect this valley from the center. And when the kingdom divides, the kings subsequently in the north, they use Hazor as a defensive position. Until one day you have a watchman like our little metal friend in that tower watching, and he sees the Assyrian army enter that valley. And that is the announcement of it's over for the northern kingdom. Assyria is coming in. You're going to die. So, most of the time, very strategic. But after years and years of rebellion, God finally says, no more. So, by the way, by that point in time, you're about in the 730s. Eventually, it's 721 BC when the northern kingdom falls completely to Assyria. So this is where you're at Hazor, and they would have seen the Assyrian army come into that valley. And of course, call me weird or whatever, I'm standing on that tower, and I was trying to imagine it. Imagine the fear in your hearts when basically the army that invented terrorism, not the word, but the concept, you see flooding into that valley. And you're just like, well, this is it. And that's what it soon was. So that's why Hazor's key. It's all strategy and it's all of that. Now, I guess you want some spiritual application. Why not? Spiritual application is Hazor is a city that goes back and forth between Canaanite, Israelite, and Israelite idol worship. So this is what happens eventually when you're in open rebellion to God. Your city ends up in ruins. Speaking of ruins, over here is a cultic site of worship. And so this was dating back to the Canaanites, but we know from reading starting in Solomon's time, they continued to use these cultic sites of worship. Anytime you read high places, those are cultic sites of worship. Sometimes they used them to worship God from, but sometimes they used them to worship idols from, right alongside worshiping God, because they were syncretistic, but that's another study for another day. This picture, though, over here on your left, I really have to think about that, is an olive press. Again, it is authentic. It is an actual olive press that dates back either the Israelites or the Canaanites. I'm not really sure which. But this is like, this here is a rope-like substance that would have been kind of a basket. It was woven. And so they would put the olives in the center. They would put the rock on top. And they'd put the log on top of the rock, and they'd let it do the work for them. As it would press down on the olives, the olive oil would come around and fill this up, and then you gather the olive oil from this well around it. And so when you're reading about the olive presses in the Bible, that's what one looks like. And I guess you can't really get an idea because, I don't have Mirage standing by it. But about that big. Kind of like a drum, so kind of about that big around. And it sat low to the ground. It was like maybe a third of a preacher height. So it sat low to the ground, and, it was an automated process. You put the olives in, and you let the rock and the log do the work. Yes?
Would that be the same as the vine press?
No, because that would have been for grapes.
Right.
So this was for olives. I'm not 100% sure. So I don't think so, but I'm not going to answer that definitively because I don't know. So all this was at Hazor. There's a lot of things. If you look around, I have an anecdote that has no connection to the Bible from the city of Hazor. So if you're bored later, having trouble sleeping, call me up and I'll tell you that story. That's a kind of a fun experience from Hazor. Let's see, there's the towers again. Now, that was Saturday. We go back to the hotel, and we eat dinner. We pack up because the next day is Sunday, and Sunday we're traveling. Now, Sunday is the day we were going to Nazareth and then traveling all the way down to the Dead Sea. You're not in Nazareth. You're looking at, let me see what the next picture is. You're looking at Nazareth from the city of Zippori. All right, you ready, Mike? Zippori, Zippori. Or it's also known as Sepphoris, and I think that's I didn't know there would be a spelling test, Sephurs. U-R-O-S or is it O-R-U-S? Here's why this little town's important. It's not mentioned in the Bible. It was the big town next to Nazareth. Nazareth, when Jesus grew up there, well, you're looking at the hillside where there's, modern builds and modern cities, but it was actually just caves. One of the most fascinating things we found out while we were there is how much they used caves to live in. Jesus was born in a cave. They're pretty much certain. They now, which cave? That's the question. but the experts, the archaeologists, everybody that's studying this, they say he would have been born in a cave in Bethlehem. And then, of course, if you follow the story, they moved down to Egypt to get away from Herod. Once Herod dies, they decide to come back. But instead of coming back to Bethlehem, Joseph says, let's go raise him up north in Galilee. That seems safer because Herod's sons were still out gallivanting around, and they thought that would be a little further out of the view. So they take him up to Nazareth. And Nazareth in the first century was a group of caves on a hillside. Now, here's what would happen. The average person in Nazareth worked in Zippori. They were just too poor to live in Zippori, which matches everything we know about Jesus' upbringing. So he would have been living in a cave in Nazareth growing up, and then probably especially as an older younger boy would be going with his father into Zippori and doing building work because that's what the carpenters did. As people in Nazareth got wealth, they would then build houses on top of the caves. I'm skipping ahead because I have a picture of that. This is a house built on top of a cave. Now, it is the cave that lots of people will tell you Jesus lived in. There's absolutely no way to prove that. like I doubt we ever will. He didn't carve into the rocks, Jesus was here, because that was vandalism and wrong. He wouldn't have done that. There's no way to prove it. But this is a great example of a cave that somebody lived in, and as they got wealth, they built a house on top of the cave and lived in that. And right now, that is all within a large church building. A large Catholic church building. Had to review in my head real quick. So that's how Jesus would have grown up, probably starting in a cave and eventually moving to a house as Joseph and himself probably did work to earn money and bring it back and start building their own home. And so over time, Nazareth got more and more built up as people made money and built their houses on top of their caves. So you're going to do what I did. I'm like, what? I've never heard this. I've never heard that. But when you start digging into it, no pun intended, that looks to be pretty accurate because, well, that's what everybody was doing. Remember Isaiah 53. He's going to appear rather common, rather lowly. And so living in a cave in Nazareth would have been common and lowly. And so it was shocking, surprising, but then the more you think about it, the more it's like, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Now, Zippori had a lot of interesting sites. They had a synagogue, but the synagogue dated back to the Byzantine period, which was after the Bible, the New Testament was completed. They had sites for the Crusaders, but the Crusaders were after the Byzantines. So these interesting things don't directly connect to the Bible. Again, we can talk about them maybe in private. I have the information on Zippori too, if you want to look at that. But the only things I want to show you from Zippori is, first of all, I hope you can see this in the picture. Can you see the divot in the picture in the stone? The divot is from a Roman chariot. That over time, the Roman chariots on the roads, and this is a first century road in Zippori, the Roman chariots on the road would would do damage and would do, and apparently they were served by a very similar Department of Highways as we are. So they didn't fix them. There's other things alongside the road that were kind of interesting, but that kind of sparked my interest. That you had this. I think it was Zipporee where we actually saw not speed bumps. What are they called on the side of the road? No. Those two. But when you go off the side of the road and it goes, rumble strips. They had rumble strips to tell the chariots you're getting too far over. They also had games that they would carve into the road, and that so people could just sit on the road and play a checker-like game. It was a very Roman thing that they had. Yeah, like a little rest stop. And this is in the middle of a city, so, kids, adults alike could just come kind of play, but it was carved into the road, so I guess, it was more like when we're playing basketball and you go, car, everybody has to get off. Chariot, everybody has to get off the road. So that I thought that was interesting, kind of tells you a little bit about how they operate, and they're people. They're people like we are. They're playing games. They're traveling. They make roads. They do things like we do, just with different technology, and theirs is somewhat more impressive because of what they had limited. I don't think we're the smartest people to ever live, but that's another class. This is a part of a mosaic that was in Zipporee that I think it's a little later, like it's more like 2nd or 3rd century. And during that time, there became an obsession amongst the culture there with Egypt. And so this, if you look at the whole thing, it's like about the Nile and how the Nile gave life to all things and all this, a lot of paganism that we would reject. But I took a picture of this part because the tower there that's the Nile River. And the tower was a way they would do taxes, because the higher the river, the better the crops you were going to have. The better the crops you're going to have, the higher they were going to tax you for it. And so that is a depiction of the taxing from the Nile, where apparently it's been a very good year because they're marking here at the top. And so they would go by that and decide how much taxes to charge somebody. That's an interesting part of Zipporee. After Zipporee, we went into Nazareth on Sunday morning. We did Zipporee in the rain all before we went to worship with the church in Nazareth. And that's where we're going to have to leave it for this evening because the bells have gone off. We worshiped there in Nazareth, and we'll talk more about that next week. Then we toured Nazareth, and then we headed south towards the Dead Sea. And so hopefully this stuff is still interesting. And I said next week we'll look at Nazareth. That's not true. In 2 weeks we'll look at Nazareth, because next week we're going to be at Valley Park for the tent meeting, 6:30. So don't forget that, and we'll go over that here in a minute.
I just have a question. So all of these things seem to have names that tie into the Bible.
Yes.
Well, I don't remember reading about Hermon in the Bible.
Mount Hermon, I thought it was mentioned once.
That name, Hermon?
I'm trying to think. I'll have to double check. I'll have to do a Bible search on one of my apps. But Mount Hermon, especially when you're considering the Old Testament, they're coming up from the south. It was to the northernmost thing. I think it's in Joshua. I really think it's in Joshua, in the borders that they give in the second half of Joshua. But I'll have to double check that. Yeah. Well, big, tall. So. All right, that's like a third bell. So we better go ahead and finish class. And we'll close class with prayer, and then we'll have a few announcements afterwards. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for the many things you've given us, and we thank you that we can study your word and use other things to study your word and hopefully enrich it for us so that we can understand better what life was like, what the people who lived like were in the Bible were like, and what we can learn from them and enrich our faith. But we do pray that you constantly bring us back to the Bible and that we will represent it accurately and show it to the world around us. We again pray that you be with those who are sick and hurting, watch over them. Pray that you be with those who are dealing with hardships and comfort them and alleviate their pain. And we again pray that if we can do anything to help these individuals, that we will be able to do so. We pray that you continue to watch over all of us, guide us in this life so we're pleasing to you. And it's in Jesus' name we pray these things.